Hello, and today we're going to be reviewing the Hart HPCS75 20-volt brushless 5.5-inch circular saw. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first up we have the battery slot. Now this particular circular saw will take any of Hart's 20-volt batteries, and for the most part it's a fairly decent showing. The battery slot itself is very loose and the battery doesn't fit in there super tightly, so if you are to drop the circular saw there is a chance that the battery could come free. I haven't had any issues with the power being interrupted to the motor while the tool is in operation, but I would like to see tighter tolerances on the battery slot in the future. Now when it comes to battery life, this particular circular saw is going to be in a little bit higher class because it's using a brushless motor, so it's definitely going to be beating out those Ryobi 5.5-inch circular saws. So it's got a decent battery life. I haven't had to replace the battery on any project I've been using this particular circular saw in, but then again I haven't been extensively using the circular saw for any super large projects either. I've been using my miter saws for those larger projects, but when it comes to just needing to cut a quick few boards quickly, this particular circular saw works great. So no complaints when it comes to the battery life for the few projects I've used the saw with. So yeah, that's about it. Moving on. Okay, real quick, the base plate. Now the base plate in this particular circular saw looks like it might be aluminum, but it is not. It is a magnetic metal, so it obviously isn't aluminum. There's all the standard features of a base plate. You have the cutouts in the front for your 0 point, and then also for just the measuring width on the front. And there is a spot where you can buy an aftermarket, saw guide or depth gauge or whatever you want to call it. And you will have to purchase that separately, so a little bit of a disappointment there, but for the most part it's a pretty decent affair, so it's fine. Moving on. Okay, next up we have all the different adjustments for your depth and for your angle. Now when it comes to the depth guide on this particular circular saw, this is not my favorite setup. I don't particularly like the fact that your depth guide is going to be on the protective shroud or the protective cover of the blade. And personally, I prefer one of my older Ryobi circular saws where there's basically a window on the back side of the circular saw that has all the different markings for whatever your depth is, and there's a little arrow so you can get precisely exactly where you need it to be. With the depth guide being on the protective shroud, there's the chance that you might have it slightly up, or it might be jammed in place and you could set it wrong, or you might just end up damaging your protective shroud or something because things happen, and you might lose your ability to figure out what your depth is completely, and you'd have to use a metal ruler to figure out whatever your depth is. So personally, this isn't my favorite setup, but it works okay. It just isn't exactly my go-to design style when it comes to figuring out what your depth is going to be on a circular saw. So not my favorite design here. Now when it comes to the overall angle on whatever you're cutting, if you need to cut at a slightly different angle, say you're trying to make something with a 45-degree angle, you can do all your basic adjustments, but to be truthful, I don't particularly like using circular saws to do that kind of cutting. I much prefer using my miter saw to do an angled cut, because that way I get a straight cut every single time. But it works just fine. The knob locks into place just fine. It's fairly easy with the indication, the gauge there, to figure out exactly where you need to set it. And as long as whatever you're trying to cut through is a fairly slim piece of wood, you can still use the 5.5-inch circular saw. I just think that at the very least you should be using the 7.25-inch circular saw. But it is what it is. It works okay. Definitely not my go-to, and I definitely prefer using a miter saw for this particular purpose. So it works, just not my favorite setup. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on to the next part of the tool. Okay, next up we have the onboard wrench, which is definitely stored in a different location, but I'm very glad that there is an onboard wrench because this just makes changing your blade so much easier and just so much more effective. The onboard wrench is stored just before the front handle, and it is out of the way. I haven't had any issues with it being in the way or falling out, so I think everything there works just fine. Now when it comes to changing the blade on your circular saw, of course you always need to pull out the battery and then pull the trigger to make sure that there's no power left in any capacitor or anything like that. And then you should be able to, change the motor, or the blade, sorry, not the motor. That would be much more complicated, much harder, and not something I would recommend a user doing. Now the blade lock is located just in front underneath the top handle. It's just to the side, and it works just fine. You gotta find the point on the circular saw that you can lock the blade in place, and then you'll be able to use the onboard wrench to loosen the blade. Of course, you want to make sure you're going the right direction. Of course, since it's a circular saw, it's the opposite direction that you think it should be, unless you're smart enough to just realize the right direction to begin with. I always go the wrong direction, then I have to go the other direction. Just a bad habit. You know, it's the opposite of the way you think it would go. So once you do that, then you'll be able to pull the circular saw's blade off. You know, it's got the same design that pretty much all circular saws use. You know, it has the two metal pieces and the bolt, so the blade clamp pieces, and then of course the bolt that holds it in place. You know, it's a pretty simple setup. It's pretty much the same as on any circular saw. It's a little bit difficult just because of where the blade lock is. So, you know, it could be a little bit better, but it's not a horrible experience. Everything here is, you know, fairly decent. It's all metal parts. Everything seems to be of a fairly high quality. You know, I didn't notice any sort of damage when I, you know, took the blade bolt out. And so, you know, it's pretty simple setup, nothing too crazy. You know, just make sure that once you've got the blade going the right way when you reassemble it, and you know, you have it all oriented correctly, and you know, as long as you can get the bolt back in, which was the one part that was a little bit irritating, was I couldn't quite get the bolt fed just right, and I dropped it several times. So you know, it's one of those things where it just did not want to go in just right. So I'm not quite sure if it was just user error, which it very well could have been, or if mine just did. You know, I haven't usually had this much of an issue, you know, changing the blade on a tool, you know, a circular saw. But, you know, once I got, you know, back in, everything tightened up just fine, and I didn't notice any issues the next time I used the circular saw. So, you know, I think everything here works pretty well, and there really is no major problems or complaints. And I am a big fan of the fact that the onboard wrench is stored on the tool. So that's the one really good thing that, you know, TTI does with a lot of their circular saws, is they're smart enough to make sure that you have the onboard wrench stored on the tool itself, and not into some little bag that you're going to lose somewhere. So, you know, everything here seemed to work just fine. I didn't really have any complaints. So yeah, so with that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, next up we have the LED light, and it is less than worthless. Well, no, not less than worthless, but it is pretty much worthless. It pretty much shines no light ahead of the tool. It's blocked off by the you know, bevel adjustment, or you know, the angle adjustment. And quite frankly, there just really is no point to it. I guess it's better than nothing if you're in a pitch black space and you have no other lighting source. But honestly, it really isn't, you know, capable of providing any light for you to work by. So, you know, I don't really know why they bothered, and I think it's a waste of time. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the trigger and safety, and it's a pretty normal show here. It's an always-on style safety, which means you always have to press it to either the left or right in order to pull the trigger, but it's a good safety feature, and I really don't have any complaints about in actual use. And like I said earlier, you can push it to either the left or right side in order for you to pull the trigger. The trigger itself is made out of plastic, just like the safety, and is going to be a single speed, or just simply, you know, an on and off switch that you basically have to press. You know, there's no variable speed here, it's just on off. So it's a pretty simple setup. No real complaints, they both work fine, the placement's fine. You know, it's fine. No complaints. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the grip and, well, the ergonomics of the tool. For the most part, it's a pretty good showing. The rear handle, or the back grip, it has plenty of rubberized texture and is large enough where you can easily get your hand in there, but it's not too large either. So quite frankly, I'm perfectly satisfied with the rear grip. The rubberized texture is fairly nice. It's a little bit on the soft side, but there are plenty of ridges and grooves and little dots and, you know, everything you would need for you to maintain your grip on the tool. Now, the foregrip is a little bit on the small side, and I personally would like to have seen it be a little bit larger. There is rubberized texture, which is nice, but it definitely just feels like it's a little bit small and not quite as, you know, controllable as other circular saws on the market. The Allen wrench does not get in the way, that's not an issue whatsoever, and for the most part the tool is still fairly easy to control and work with. You know, that shouldn't be any surprise, it is only 5.5 inches when it comes to the blade size. So, you know, there really isn't anything majorly wrong with the grips on this particular tool or the ergonomics, but for me personally, I would have liked to have seen the foregrip be a little bit larger. But with that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, without a battery, it weighs 4.72 pounds. And with a 4 amp hour battery, the tool weighs 6.09 pounds. So not too bad for a little circular saw. Okay, let's go ahead and talk real quick about this saw in use. I have to say, I actually really enjoy using this particular circular saw. I really like the fact that it's so small and compact, and also it just takes regular Hart batteries, and it has plenty of power for dealing with 2x4s, and you know, that's pretty much the only thing I need this for is when I need to do quick cuts on a 2x4. Like I said earlier in the video, if I need to do any sort of a miter cut or a bevel cut or, you know, any sort of angle cutting, I'm just going to get out the miter saw. But if all I need to do is a couple of quick cuts and I don't need to be super precise or need to replicate, you know, get the exact size on every single cut exactly the same, this particular circular saw does great. So, you know, quite frankly, it's a circular saw I like using, and it's kind of in a category of all by itself. There are other, you know, 5.5-inch circular saws, but there aren't really all that many, you know, brushless 5.5-inch circular saws that takes a, you know, 20 or 18 volt battery. And, you know, quite frankly, it's a handy little tool to have. It's got plenty of power and it's able to handle most cuts really well. And the board that I was cutting down the middle of was a 2x12, and it was able to go all the way down it without a problem. I did stop a couple times because I had to swap the board from side to side, but it handled the whole job really quickly, and I didn't pause for any longer than, you know, 5 minutes, and I didn't have any issues. So, you know, I've used it on a couple of small jobs now, and it's had great performance. The only thing I really don't like about it is the forward grip is a little bit small, but, you know, other than that, no major complaints whatsoever. I don't think 5.5-inch circular saws are necessarily the best saws to do, you know, the angle cutting, but if all you're doing is cutting some very, very small thin boards, it shouldn't have an issue whatsoever. You're not going to be able to do that with on a 2x4, but you really can't do that on a 2x4 with some of the other circular saws that are on the market anyway. So, you know, for the most part, I've been pretty happy with this particular saw's performance, and I think it does a good job. So let's recap with the pros and cons, and then we'll finish out the video with my final conclusion. First pro is 20 volt. Now this is where I'd normally say that you could use another tool brand's batteries in this particular tool at your own risk. But unfortunately, I don't really see any adapters to take, say, a Makita battery or a DeWalt battery or Milwaukee battery and use it in a Hart tool. There's plenty of adapters out there where you can use, you know, Hart batteries in other brand tools, but there really isn't any way to use other brand batteries in Hart tools, which is kind of odd. But, you know, it still is a pro that this thing's 20 volt, and it does seem to have enough power to cut through pretty much any 2x4 material that I've been using thus far. So it is still a pro. Pro number 2, brushless. The brushless motor allows you to have better battery life, it has a longer lifespan, and it can provide more power. So in my opinion, this is definitely a major pro. Pro number 3, small. The small size of this circular saw makes it easier to use and makes it easier to transport and store. So in my opinion, this is a pro. Powerful. Considering the size and the brand, I'm actually pretty happy with the amount of power that this particular circular saw has. It definitely is more powerful than the Skill 5.5-inch circular saw I reviewed earlier last year, late last year, or whatever I reviewed that, and it's also more powerful than the Ryobi 5.5 circular saws. So quite frankly, it is an impressive little saw. Onboard wrench, you know I love it. It is very handy, and it also means you don't have to go looking for it, and there's less of a chance you're going to lose it. So in my opinion, this is a pro. And the first con is the LED light. Unfortunately, the LED light is pretty much worthless on this particular tool, and I think they need to go back to a design course in order to figure out what the point of the light is. So in my opinion, this is a con. Price. Overall, the price of this particular circular saw is a little bit on the high side. It's not horrible, and you can pick it up on sale occasionally for a fairly decent price. But when you consider that this is a 5.5-inch circular saw and you compare it against, say, a 7.5 or 7.25-inch circular saw, there isn't that big of a difference, and so in some ways it might make more sense to buy a, well, larger circular saw. But if your goal is to have a more compact and lightweight circular saw, it's not a horrible price for this particular tool either. Base non-aluminum. It isn't the biggest deal in the world, but it really does look like an aluminum, you know, base from a distance, but it isn't. It definitely is still better than that horrible black painted metal that Ryobi uses, but for the most part, I still wish it was aluminum. And last but not least, small forward handle. It isn't the biggest deal in the world either, but I do wish it was a little bit larger. And that's it for the pros and cons. Final thoughts on this particular circular saw. At the end of the day, I think this particular circular saw is actually a very nice little tool. It's nice and compact, it's fairly lightweight, it has a brushless motor, and it has plenty of power. It does a good job of doing cross cuts and even rip cuts, and I haven't had any major issues while using it. There are a few small minor gripes I have, the front handle, the LED light, and the fact that the base is in aluminum. But if you discount all that, because none of those are actually that big of a deal, it's a great little tool. And the price isn't horrible either. Like I said, I've said in other videos, I'm kind of a cheapskate, and the price could always be lower in my opinion. But in today's world, it's not a horrible price, and when you compare it against other, circular saws in the same kind of category, it's actually fairly well, competitively priced. So, at the end of the day, I do like this particular circular saw. I've been using it fairly often, and, I don't really have any major complaints, and I haven't had any major issues with it. So, this particular circular saw comes recommended. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and we will see you all next time. God bless.